topic tonight is changes to domestic violence support services in New South Wales. Who gives the best support for women fleeing domestic violence and why?
Christine Bird has helped set up women's refuges in New Zealand in 1974 and in Australia in 1996. She has a master's degree in social science and works as a specialist in all forms of family violence and trauma. She joined No Shelter because she feels the New South Wales Government's housing reforms are a threat to the safety of women and children at risk of family violence, and that such families have had their need for sanctuary sacrificed to save the government's spending on the separate issue of homelessness. Her concern about this public and community housing reform is that it is further evidence of the government's corporatisation, Christianisation, anti-union and anti-feminist agendas, and I think we can all agree with that.
I've called out of 30 years of very, very hard slog in the community sector, strong focus on family violence. And this reform is my reason for getting very, very strongly involved with the community and strongly involved with an organisation called No Shelter. No Shelter is a collective that participates in struggles against gendered violence. We recognise that gender and gender inequality are imposed through systemic violence. As women, this violence is what governs what we experience as possible. We want lives that we can determine for ourselves, and so together we seek to make ourselves freer by refusing austerity together. At the moment, much of our energy is directed towards organising against the going home, staying home reforms that have begun the rollout of competitive tendering processes across welfare, resulting in the closure of women's refuges across New South Wales. We're currently organising a fight back against another wave of closures to feminist services that will occur on Friday the 31st of October. We hope to have community meetings, a press conference and an action on the Friday the 31st of October and the following days. There will also be a contingent of people to save women's refuges at the Reclaim the Night rally on the evening of the 31st of October. So please come along to all events and show support. So I'm going to start with a quote. I was very interested to hear what the preferred tenders had to say about this reform. So I'm going to start from a quote it was released by the Public Affairs Manager. So these are community services that have public affairs managers. Public Affairs Manager of the Wesley Mission, who says that the reforms mean a more integrated approach and an opportunity to break the cycle of intergenerational homelessness. So that's their perspective. There has been no comment from the four big faith-based charities that have done very well out of these reforms, no comment as to the devastation wreaking havoc within the women's refuges across New South Wales, no comment. So I understand that the focus of this talk is who is best at providing domestic violence services. And I would say that those whose priority is to learn from and listen to the women and children who have experienced it, that's the bedrock, that's the university. Those who have, as a consequence of listening, have an understanding of its complexity and the terrible effects of it across generations. Those who have learnt of and comprehend the enormous need of its victims for psychological and physical safety. Those who understand the great difficulty in obtaining that safety. Those who remain consultative constantly with the victims. And those who have decades of experience in providing domestic violence, trauma therapy, safety planning, parenting support for traumatised parents, support and therapy for witnessing children, and also general domestic violence counselling. And this experience of people working within women's refuges informs our training, our policies and our procedures, because these are organisations set up to assist domestic violence survivors. That's our speciality. Organisations who have no experience in this work and many of these organisations are now walking into the buildings that belong to women's refuges, they can only purchase a facsimile of this experience and understanding. And consequently, they fail to understand the need for many of the policies and procedures that make all the difference for developing trust, safety, and positive change in the lives of survivors. So they will fail. So I provided domestic violence services for 24 years in the Southern Shire and before that in New Zealand. I've run a medium-term women's and children's refuge unfunded for 17 years. And that fact is the only reason for its survival. So I work with intergenerational abuse, usually complex need families, usually mothers that have had very, very difficult childhoods, consequent difficulty in their adult relationships, difficulty with family members, difficulty with friendships, difficulty with social skills, life skills, and therefore difficulty with parenting. And I and the others in our service also work with the children themselves in terms of the abuse that they've witnessed, the abuse that they've experienced, and the effects on them of that, and their attachment with their parents, various different forms of attachment with their parents. It's fascinating and quite difficult work. However, so I've been doing that for 17 years. But the recent consultative reform, I wasn't told about it, I wasn't consulted about it, I was never given an opportunity to speak or to provide information. But I did get a phone call. I got a phone call saying, "Oh, do you manage such and such a property?" Yes. Do you provide the property management or the support service? Well, actually both, because they are absolutely intertwined. If you've got medium-term accommodation and you can't have a worker on site, which was our situation, we're not allowed to have a worker on site, then safety is absolutely entwined with confidentiality with property management. So I said, well, both. Oh, can't quite get our head around that, both. Well, just to let you know that your property has been accepted in a tender that we've accepted from another organisation. Stunned silence from me. Well, how do you accept a tender for a property that has no funding? Silence, agonised silence from him. Because, of course, the tenders were based on funded services. Anyway, he said he would get back to me next week, 4 weeks later, during which time I was unable to mention any of this to the 8 women and 11 children in the program. So I'm sitting on this, waiting. I get a phone call saying, "Oh, sorry, big mistake, you were on the wrong list. No, this doesn't concern unfunded services." So the only reason why our program, which is enormously successful, it's the only one of its kind in New South Wales, the only reason why we continue to exist is because we were never funded. But within the history of feminist women's refuges, they were set up by women who were unfunded. They were run in the beginning by volunteers, and so I draw on that history in the work that I and the other members of our organisation do. If my organisation is defunded or not chosen to tender, it's interesting the characteristics of what allows you to be chosen to tender. As a result of my speaking out, then that's a risk worth taking at this time because of what I can see happening across New South Wales. I believe my responsibility and allegiance is to the victims of violence, not to the government and not to any organisation, including my own. I speak for the silenced women who were never consulted and those who were consulted but whose advice were watered down or ignored. And I also speak for the silenced workers who were told not to speak out. So the evidence is, as previously mentioned, that women's refuges are the best response to women and children in fear from post-separation abuse and threats. Because that's another thing that these big organisations have no experience of and no understanding of, is that domestic violence is not an AVO in a bed and a case plan. That domestic violence becomes even more torturous when it devolves into post-separation abuse. It can go on for years. It can lead to child abuse for years. And that's the reason why I'm fighting as I do, because our organisation and women's refuges have the capacity to provide safety to women from post-separation domestic violence. Under these reforms, women's refuges and organisations such as ourselves, and also specialist services for youth or NSB populations or Indigenous populations, they've been tendered practically out of existence. And our organisation couldn't tender because there is now literally no tender and no funding for providing just a women's refuge. That's extraordinary. So as I go out, released by the constraints of fighting within our community service just to get by, released by the wonder of this reform to go out and do grassroots organising, I'm hearing the response from people in the community, and they cannot understand or believe what's happening. So when you tell them, you can't set up a women's refuge now, there is no funding for a women's refuge as a standalone women's refuge, they're astonished. They're astonished to hear what's happening with the refuges in their areas, and they're starting to hear the stories from workers and from referring organisations and from women in their community and families in their community whose family members are seeking refuge. Homelessness New South Wales say they've lost 26 services, and interestingly 4 of their 9 board members have resigned since the tenders. They've documented the start of the change that's sweeping across the system, and this change documents that the costs have reduced. So isn't that great and wonderful? 5,000 fewer people have been housed since the reforms. Women's-specific housing has dropped from 27.5% to 18.1%, and of course we can expect it to drop dramatically in the near future. And the number of organisations have dropped from 250 to 180. Statewide organisations have gained from 31% to now 38%, and that's going to increase. And many of these large organisations were chosen as preferred tenders. So in particular, the department has preferred the tenders of the Catholic Corporation, the Anglican Corporation and the Wesleyan Corporation. The department offers domestic violence survivors services through the Staying Home Leaving Violence program, where a minority of women feel safe living in the environment where they were assaulted and abused, and they hope and believe that a piece of paper will stop the perpetrator from returning. In some cases that works, in a minority of cases that is sufficient. However, I call it the sitting duck program because 38 to 36% of AVOs are breached. That's more evidence. The department offers those women seeking safety from a perpetrator a homelessness service, and by doing so they risk women's safety by reducing access to women's refuges who are specialists in women's safety. Already half of all women seeking a place in a refuge must be turned away, and now they have to stand in line with all the homeless who may be homeless for reasons that may put domestic violence survivors and their children at risk, and may re-traumatise them. And I know the local refuges. I've visited many refuges, so I'm seeing in my mind's eye how you can turn a facility such as those I've seen, so cottages with adjoining walls, their front doors about 2 metres apart, massed in a block. And what are we going to have? We're going to have, somebody with mental health problems in one, somebody, a family in extreme conflict and intergenerational poverty in the next one, a woman and her children fleeing domestic violence, and one after that, a young person homeless for whatever reason, and the next one, somebody with poverty as a result of long-term drug and alcohol issues, and the one after that, living in basically a compound in their little cottages, going to the train station, going to the shops, going to the hotels, going to wherever it may be. Now, I know from my experience in providing this medium-term accommodation how easy it is to disclose information. We've had many such situations in the Sutherland Child where I work. It's absolutely unworkable in terms of the link between safety and confidentiality. So, research on child murders between 2010 and 2012 showed that 64% of these child murders were domestic violence cases. And so, for me, I came out of the woodwork because the safety of women and children is what most concerns me. And this is why I'm so angry that the homelessness issue has been put together with the domestic violence issue, with the women's refuge issue. The evidence is that in New South Wales, 87% of domestic violence survivors are women. The evidence is that domestic violence is the only criminal charge that instead of reducing is actually increasing, and this is the time, therefore, to increase safe women-only refuges, not close them down. So if we're looking at domestic violence as an issue, this is what we would be doing. This policy on homelessness fails to address the actual risks from domestic violence perpetrators. It ignores the reality of stalking, of tracking through technology. It ignores all the system failures, like, for example, releasing perpetrators from prison without informing victims. And this policy will not provide the level of safety and access to safe accommodation that domestic violence survivors in New South Wales need. In 2013, 28,291 domestic violence assaults were reported in New South Wales. So 28,291. And remember, 87% of those were of women. And then we have women fleeing domestic violence who already, half of them, can't even get into a refuge, lining up with everyone else that's homeless for the properties that used to be available for women seeking safety, they and their children seeking safety. This policy will force women and children to return to violent and abusive homes. It fails to provide protection to children and will cause more children to witness and experience violence. It will also cause more children to be taken from mothers unable to protect them or to find safety from ongoing stalking and abuse. So last Sunday, I heard just such a case from somebody at a fair. It was a grandmother telling me about her daughter who lost her children. She had 1 month to find accommodation in the homelessness service. 3 children on Centrelink payments. The family put money together to get her sent to Cairns to try to find accommodation up there, affordable accommodation up there. She's able to do that because she doesn't have family law orders preventing her from leaving the area. If she had family law orders, she would probably have lost the children. Right. The rate of murder of mothers and children in Australia is already shocking. The public's already horrified by the number of these murders. So this is not the time to be closing refuges, it's the time to be funding more of them. In our area, we had a very shocking murder last year. One of our clients, not long after that, after she moved out of our accommodation, that was based on the perpetrator contracting someone else in prison with him to stalk and harass her. And then when he was released without her being told, he broke into our unit, smashing the window, leaving glass all over the baby's cot. Fortunately, he was found, sent back to prison. When he came back out, after she'd moved into generalist housing, he found the house that she was in by tracking family members visiting her. and he burnt it down the day after Mother's Day. This is the reality. This is the reality. This is the reality that this government doesn't understand. In fact, in both places, this kind of policy has previously been trialled. It was shown to be an abject failure in protecting women and children fleeing domestic violence, which is what we were about. However, this policy is about homelessness. It's a grossly flawed policy done through co-opted and inadequate consultation. It gives domestic violence victims not what they want, not what they need, but what the government is prepared to pay for. And just as the department is walking away from its responsibility to provide domestic violence protection, it's also walking away from its responsibility to provide child protection. It's walking away from services to Aboriginal women and other vulnerable women. And at present, more Aboriginal women are having their children taken from them than occurred in the stolen generation. That's why we call this reform the Stay Home and Shut Up reform. Because a mother seeking refuge and not able to find it will lose her children if she can't find shelter. She's competing with all the homeless at the moment, and if she can't get accommodation because homeless people have moved into the refuges, she can't couch surf or live on the streets with children. Recovery from abuse and violence needs a better response than a bed and a case plan. Also, many of the new homeless services are sacking children's support staff, domestic violence staff, Aboriginal staff. Succeeding in their preferred tenders through their corporate expertise, they're using experienced refuge staff to train their inexperienced staff before then sacking them, or allowing a few of them to compete for jobs. Successful tenders succeeded through the organisation's size, not their quality of service or their understanding of the issues. They are religious charities primarily, moving into the business of welfare corporate style to get access to government funding. They often have a poor record in fair pay and workers' conditions. The evidence is that churches have covered up domestic violence and child abuse. Pastors and ministers advise women to return and stay in abusive and violent homes. They advised forgiveness of perpetrators who were never made accountable. I've spoken to women with exactly this experience. They've ignored the evidence that domestic violence is largely perpetrated by men on women and children. That's the reality. That's why you need a lot of women's refuges. Makes sense. They ignored the reality of and research into perpetrators, their motivations, calculations, and exploitations. The question I ask myself, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is who will protect the women and children in the churches? The evidence is of the children's remarkable ability to overlook the catastrophic numbers of children abused, women abused, and mothers killed. And the department also seems remarkably unable to recall the evidence of all the research worldwide that feminist women's refuges are the most effective response to male violence against women and children that has ever been devised. The department's preferred tenders largely went to the churches that failed to comprehend gendered violence, failed to protect children from paedophile priests, failed to protect children they took from Aboriginal parents, and failed to respect Indigenous culture and beliefs. The Department of Preferred Tendering has handed most of the refuges closing last month, this month, and more to close in the year to come, to the same churches attempting to defend themselves at the Royal Commission. So the stories are flooding in as I speak to people out in the community, to workers who are talking about having to run mixed gender groups and the effect that that has on some of the women that they're working with, to having to work with men who have criminal histories and AVOs against them. One worker talked about they are effectively hiding them. They talk about the inflexibility of the assessment of low, medium and high need, and each level with a certain specific number and type of services attached to it. But if a case suddenly goes from high to low or vice versa, it can't be changed. And in domestic violence cases, there are sudden risks that easily appear, often as a consequence of system failure, stalking or unthinking disclosure. So this one-size-fits-all cheapness of this approach devalues the people that they assist, wastes time, wastes resources. Gendered violence requires gendered recovery from rape, from gendered psychological abuse, from male perpetrator networks that protect perpetrators from courts and criminal charges. Women's refuges are a right for women and not a whim to be taken away by the government or by the opportunism of large corporations or charities. They were developed by women for women. And I know because, once again, going out in the community, people are telling me about their mothers and their grandmothers who helped set them up. I spoke to someone who's given me contacts about getting that history. They are our social capital, originally run by volunteers, then continuing with underpaid or voluntary contribution by the feminist workers. New South Wales Government has a human rights obligation to provide women's refuges. The history of that community effort and that wonderful contribution by feminists has been ignored. And we now hear of lone, forlorn outreach workers struggling as satellites from large agencies who have no local connection in those communities. Okay. Tenders favour large corporations, as in this case, who are prepared to carry out the economies of scale, reduce the quality of services and silence concerns and dissent. So I know that this is an extremely unpopular policy. I hear it directly. If this reform was entirely motivated to improve housing options for the poor, why is intimidation and silencing necessary? If this reform is beneficial, why are hugely experienced staff being sacked, refuges remaining empty, local communities refusing to use them, women being referred across the state, and why are those refuges remaining being swamped by increasingly desperate and serious referrals? And as for those who were the preferred tenders, where is their concern that New South Wales is losing its women's refuges? Why are they silent? These charities and the government have a responsibility to give more than lip service to the safety of women and children. While they are blind because it's better for them, the stories and experience of what is happening are travelling across the state and throughout the community, and they won't be silenced.
Well done.